I'm not going to pretend I don't notice it anymore. For a long time, I thought whatever was happening between us would eventually settle into something easier to understand. I thought the unfamiliarity would disappear, the intensity would become ordinary, and eventually I would stop wondering why your presence felt different from everyone else's. But it never became ordinary. It became familiar, and somehow that was more dangerous, because unfamiliar things are easy to question. You can keep your distance from them. You can tell yourself they are temporary, unexpected, maybe even meaningless. But familiarity is different. Familiarity gets comfortable. It slips into your thoughts without asking. It becomes part of your routine without announcing itself. And before you realize what happened, you stop noticing the person as someone outside your world. You simply begin including them in it. That is what happened with you. I didn't decide to make room for you. I didn't sit down and choose to trust your presence. I didn't plan to let you become someone whose reactions I could almost predict, whose silence I could understand, whose absence I could feel without needing a reason. It happened quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it. At first, I thought I was simply paying attention. Then I realized I was remembering. Then I realized I was comparing. Then I realized I was expecting. And eventually I realized I had started thinking from the perspective of someone who knew you. That was the moment I couldn't ignore anymore. Because knowing someone changes the way you see the world. Not everything, just certain things. A sentence becomes something you know they would understand. A moment becomes something you wish they could see. A thought becomes something you instinctively want to share. And suddenly, they exist in places where they aren't physically present. That's what you became. A presence without needing to be present. And I don't know when that happened. Maybe it started with the way you listened. Not the ordinary kind of listening, where someone waits for their turn to respond. You listened for what wasn't being said. You noticed hesitation. You noticed changes in tone. You noticed when a simple sentence carried something underneath it. You noticed the difference between silence because there was nothing to say and silence because there was too much. Most people don't notice those things. They hear words. You noticed meaning, and being understood at that level does something to a person. It makes hiding feel unnecessary, not impossible, just unnecessary. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to constantly edit myself. I could leave a thought unfinished. I could say something imperfectly. I could disappear into silence for a moment without worrying that you would misunderstand the silence. You didn't rush to fill it. You let it exist, and somehow that made me feel seen more than any question ever could. Because sometimes the greatest form of understanding is not asking someone to explain, it's knowing when they shouldn't have to. That became one of the things I noticed most about you. You never seemed desperate to reach the parts of me I kept private. You never demanded access. You didn't make my distance a challenge. You didn't treat my quietness like something you needed to fix. You simply remained there. And strangely, that made me want to come closer. Not because you pulled me, because you didn't. There is something powerful about someone who doesn't chase what they care about, someone who can stay present without becoming demanding, someone who can say, without words, you don't have to give me more than you're ready to give. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I experienced it. Maybe that's why you got through places other people couldn't. They tried to understand me by opening doors. You understood me by noticing which doors I opened myself. That difference mattered. It still does. because I have always been careful about access, who gets close, who gets information, who gets to see the parts that aren't polished, who gets to know what happens when I stop pretending everything is under control. I have always had boundaries, not because I don't care, because I care enough to protect certain things. But you didn't challenge those boundaries. You made me question why some of them were there. And that's harder because I can defend a boundary when someone is trying to cross it. But what do I do when someone simply makes the boundary feel unnecessary? That's what you did. You didn't force your way into my world. You became familiar with it. And slowly, I stopped noticing where the line between my world and the space you occupied actually was. That realization scared me. Not because you were dangerous, because you mattered. Those are two very different things. Danger makes you run. Importance makes you hesitate, and I found myself hesitating more than once. I would tell myself to create distance. Then something small would happen, a conversation, a look, a sentence, a moment of understanding, and the distance would disappear again, not because I couldn't maintain it, because I didn't want to. That is the part I can't explain away anymore. If I truly wanted this gone, it would be gone. I know myself well enough to understand that. When something doesn't belong in my life, I know how to remove it. I don't keep unnecessary things around simply because they're difficult to let go of, but I didn't remove you. I kept making room, quietly, almost unconsciously. And eventually, I realized that the decision had already been made somewhere inside me. I had allowed you to matter. I just hadn't admitted it. Maybe that's what takes the longest. Not developing a connection. Admitting that the connection has become important, because once you admit that, everything becomes more serious. You can't keep calling it coincidence. You can't keep pretending you don't care. You can't keep hiding behind uncertainty. You have to accept that something has changed, and something has changed. You changed the way I notice people. You changed the way I interpret silence. You changed the way I understand closeness. You changed something about the way I understand myself. And I don't think you ever intended to. That may be the strangest part. You weren't trying to become important. You weren't trying to leave an impression. You weren't trying to get inside my thoughts. You simply existed as yourself. And somehow, that was enough. Maybe that's why this feels different from everything else. There was no performance, no strategy, no attempt to impress, no pressure to create something. It just happened naturally. Two people noticing each other, then understanding each other, then becoming familiar, then realizing that the familiarity had become something neither of them could easily ignore. And now here we are, somewhere between what this was and what it might become. I don't know what comes next. I don't think you do either. And strangely, I'm okay with that. For once, I don't need an immediate answer. I don't need to force a label onto something just because uncertainty makes me uncomfortable. Maybe some things deserve time. Maybe some connections need to exist without being defined before they reveal what they are capable of becoming. But there is one thing I know. I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to act like your presence doesn't affect me. I don't want to dismiss the way my mind searches for your perspective. I don't want to ignore the way certain moments feel incomplete until I imagine how you would see them. I don't want to pretend your absence feels exactly like anyone else's. It doesn't. And I think you know that. Maybe not completely. Maybe you haven't allowed yourself to say it either. But I think there are moments when you feel it. Those moments when neither of us says anything, yet somehow the silence feels like a conversation. Those moments when one look seems to contain more understanding than an entire explanation. Those moments when something feels familiar before either of us can explain why. Maybe that's what this is. Not something loud, not something dramatic. Something quiet enough to be missed by everyone else, but obvious to the two people experiencing it. And maybe that is why I don't want to destroy it by forcing it to become something before it is ready. I would rather let it unfold honestly. Let it become whatever it is supposed to become, because if it is real, it won't need to be forced. It will survive honesty. It will survive time. It will survive the moments when we don't know what to say. And if it isn't meant to become more, then I would rather know that honestly than create something artificial just because I was afraid of losing what already exists. But even if it never becomes what people would call a relationship, I can't deny what it has already been. You have already changed something in me. You have already made me question things I thought I understood. You have already shown me that closeness doesn't always arrive through constant conversation. Sometimes it arrives through recognition, sometimes through silence, sometimes through a person who notices you without trying to own any part of you. And maybe that is why your presence feels so rare. You don't make me feel watched. You make me feel understood. There is a difference. Being watched makes you conscious of yourself. Being understood lets you forget yourself for a moment. Around you, I sometimes forget that I am supposed to be careful. I forget that I usually calculate every word. I forget that I normally keep certain thoughts behind several locked doors. And when I realize I've done that, I become aware of just how far this has gone. Because I don't do that easily. I don't let people become part of my internal world without noticing. Yet somehow you are there, not loudly, not demanding space, just there. And perhaps that is the most honest description I can give. You are there, in the thoughts I don't speak, in the moments I pause, in the questions I never ask, in the perspectives I instinctively consider, in the silence that doesn't feel empty anymore. You are there, and I have stopped trying to remove that fact from my mind. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe accepting it is enough. Maybe the point was never to decide immediately what you mean to me. Maybe the point was to realize that you already mean something. Something real, something difficult to define, something I didn't plan, something I didn't expect, something I would have rejected if it had arrived demanding attention. But because it arrived quietly, I let it stay. And now I understand that sometimes the things we allow in quietly become the things we cannot imagine removing. That's what you became. Not a disruption, not a distraction, not an escape, a presence, a reference point, a person whose existence somehow changed the way certain things feel. And if I'm being completely honest, I don't want to go back to before. I don't want to forget what it feels like to be understood without having to explain every part of myself. I don't want to return to believing that distance is always safer. I don't want to convince myself that caring is weakness, because you showed me something different. You showed me that someone can come close without taking anything away. That someone can understand without controlling. That someone can notice without judging. That someone can matter without becoming a burden. And maybe that is the real reason I haven't walked away. Not because I don't know how. Because I finally know what I would be walking away from. I would be walking away from the rare feeling of being recognized. From the quiet certainty that someone sees more than the surface, from the strange comfort of knowing that there is someone who understands the things I don't always know how to explain. And I don't know if I'm ready to lose that. Maybe I'm not supposed to know yet. Maybe some decisions aren't made in a single moment. Maybe they are made every day through small choices. The choice to stay, the choice to listen, the choice not to run, the choice to remain honest. And every time I choose not to walk away, I am saying something without saying it. I am saying that this matters, maybe more than I intended, maybe more than I expected, but it matters. And that is the truth I can no longer hide from myself. You became part of something I thought belonged only to me, my thoughts, my silence, my way of seeing things. And somehow, instead of feeling invaded, I feel understood. That is rare. So rare that I don't want to treat it carelessly. I don't know what tomorrow will make of this. I don't know whether time will bring us closer or teach us how to carry the distance. I don't know whether one day we'll look back and realize this was the beginning of something much bigger, or whether this will remain one of those rare connections that changed us without ever becoming what we expected. But I know this, I will remember it. I will remember how naturally it happened, how quietly it grew, how neither of us seemed to ask for it, how somehow, without promises or plans, you became someone I couldn't simply categorize as another person passing through my life. You became an exception, and I have never been comfortable with exceptions. But perhaps some things aren't meant to be controlled. Perhaps some people aren't meant to fit neatly into the systems we build to keep ourselves safe. Perhaps sometimes the right person arrives and doesn't destroy your walls. They simply make you realize you don't need every wall anymore. And maybe that's what you did. You didn't change me into someone else. You simply made it harder for me to hide from who I already was. That is why this feels so significant, because the deepest connections don't always give you something new. Sometimes they reveal something that was already inside you, something waiting, something unfinished, something you had forgotten existed. You revealed that part of me, and now that I have seen it, I can't pretend I haven't. So if I seem different, maybe that's why. If I seem quieter, maybe it's because I'm thinking more honestly. If I seem closer, maybe it's because I've stopped pretending distance is necessary. And if I ever tell you that you matter, understand that those words will probably be smaller than what I actually mean. Because some people matter through what they do. You matter through what your presence has changed. And that kind of impact is difficult to describe. It doesn't disappear when the conversation ends. It doesn't disappear when the room becomes empty. It doesn't disappear when the day moves on. It stays quietly, deeply, without asking to be noticed. And perhaps that is the most honest thing I can say about you. You stayed. Not necessarily beside me, not necessarily in the way people usually mean when they talk about staying. You stayed inside the way I think, inside the way I notice, inside the way I understand certain silences, inside the way I now recognize a kind of connection I once believed was almost impossible. And once someone changes your understanding of something that deeply, they don't simply become a memory. They become part of the person you become afterward. That's what you are now. Part of the person I am becoming. And maybe I don't need to know what happens next. Maybe I only need to be honest about what has already happened. You found a place in me without asking for one. I noticed it, I resisted it, then I understood it. And finally, I accepted it. Whatever this becomes, whatever it doesn't become, I won't call it meaningless, because it wasn't. It isn't. And somewhere inside me, I think I knew that long before I was brave enough to say it. Maybe the hardest part is not accepting that you matter. Maybe the hardest part is accepting how much you matter without knowing what to do with that truth. Because there are some feelings that don't arrive with instructions. They don't tell you where to place them. They don't explain what they want. They simply appear, they become familiar, and slowly begin changing the way you see everything around them. That's what happened here. I kept waiting for clarity to arrive. I thought eventually there would be a moment when everything would make sense. A moment where I could look at this connection and say, this is exactly what it is. But that moment never came. Instead, something else happened. I became comfortable with not knowing. And for someone like me, that's not a small thing. I've always believed that if you understand something, you can control your response to it. If you know what something means, you know how to handle it. If you know where something is going, you can prepare yourself for it. But you don't give me that certainty. You give me something much more difficult. You give me possibility. And possibility has always been harder for me than certainty, because certainty has limits. Possibility doesn't. It can become anything, it can grow, it can disappear. It can surprise you. It can become something you never expected. And maybe that's why I've been so careful with this. Not because I don't feel it, because I do, more than I expected. But feeling something doesn't automatically mean you know what to do with it. Sometimes you can recognize the importance of something and still be afraid of where it might lead. That's where I am, somewhere between understanding and uncertainty, between wanting to move closer and wanting to protect what already exists. Because there is a strange fear that comes with naming something beautiful. What if naming it changes it? What if the moment we define it, we start expecting things from it? What if the freedom that allowed it to grow disappears? What if we become so focused on what it is supposed to be that we stop noticing what it actually is? I don't want that. I don't want to turn something honest into something performed. I don't want us to start behaving according to a label instead of responding naturally to each other. Because what made this different was that neither of us seemed to be trying. There was no script, no plan, no expectation. Just two people somehow understanding each other in ways that neither of us completely understood ourselves. And maybe that's why I want to protect it. Not from distance, from pressure. I don't want you to feel like you have to prove what you feel. I don't want myself to feel like I have to explain every reaction. I don't want something genuine to become a test. Because some connections don't need constant reassurance. They need room to breathe, room to exist, room to become whatever they are naturally becoming. And I think that's what I've been learning from you. That closeness doesn't always mean holding tighter. Sometimes it means trusting enough to loosen your grip. That understanding doesn't require constant conversation. Sometimes it exists most clearly when neither person is speaking. And that care doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it appears in the smallest details, remembering something, noticing a change, giving someone space, staying when leaving would be easier. Those things say more than dramatic words ever could. And I have noticed them. Maybe you think I haven't. Maybe you think the small things disappear into everything else. They don't. I remember more than I say. And that's another thing you probably don't know about me. When something matters, I notice details. I may not react immediately. I may not tell you that I noticed, but I do. I remember the little changes in your voice, the moments when you become quieter, the things you avoid explaining, the things you say casually that I know weren't casual at all. And sometimes I wonder if you do the same with me, if you've noticed the changes I haven't mentioned, if you've noticed that I don't pull away the way I used to, if you've noticed that my silence around you has changed, if you've noticed that I'm no longer trying to keep every thought perfectly contained, maybe you have. Maybe that's why there are moments when it feels like we're having a conversation without speaking. Maybe that's why some interactions feel longer than they actually are. Maybe that's why I sometimes leave a conversation still thinking about something you said hours later, not because the words were extraordinary, because the meaning behind them was. And that is something I can't manufacture. You either feel that kind of understanding or you don't. You either recognize it or you don't. And I recognize it. That's why I stopped looking for reasons to dismiss it. There was a time when I could have convinced myself this was temporary. I could have told myself that it was simply curiosity, that it was simply the excitement of meeting someone different, that eventually the interest would fade. But it didn't. The more time passed, the less I needed an explanation, and the more obvious the truth became. You weren't becoming less significant, you were becoming more familiar, more natural, more integrated. And there is something almost frightening about how natural you feel, because I expected something this meaningful to feel complicated. Instead, it feels simple. Not easy, civil. There is a difference. It isn't easy, because there are still questions, there are still boundaries, there are still things neither of us says. There are still moments where I wonder whether I'm reading too much into something. But underneath all of that, there is simplicity. I know I notice you. I know I care about what happens to you. I know your presence affects me. I know your absence is felt. I know that when something matters to me, I don't need to be reminded of it. And you matter. That's the simplest truth in all of this. Everything else is complicated because I'm trying to understand what that truth means. But the truth itself isn't complicated. You matter. And maybe that's why I'm finally allowing myself to say it. Not as a promise, not as a confession meant to create pressure, just as honesty. You matter. You have become someone whose existence has weight in my life, someone whose perspective I respect, someone whose silence I understand, someone whose presence I don't take for granted. And I don't want to pretend otherwise, simply because honesty makes things more vulnerable. Maybe vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. Maybe sometimes strength is simply refusing to lie about what you feel. I've spent enough time protecting myself from uncertainty. Maybe now I need to learn how to exist inside it, because there is no guarantee with people, no guarantee that someone stays, no guarantee that circumstances remain the same, no guarantee that two people who understand each other will always have the opportunity to remain close. That's the painful truth. And maybe that's why people try so hard to control relationships. They want certainty. They want promises. They want something they can hold on to. But you can't completely hold another person. You can only choose how honestly you show up while they are there. And that's what I want to do. Be honest, not possessive, not demanding, not afraid, just honest. If I care, I want to be able to admit that I care. If I miss you, I don't want to turn that feeling into anger. If I feel close to you, I don't want to create distance simply because closeness scares me. If you matter to me, I don't want pride to make me act like you don't. Maybe that's the real change. Not that you entered my life, but that you changed the way I respond to people who do. Before you, I thought protecting myself meant keeping people from getting too close. Now I'm beginning to understand that sometimes protection means choosing carefully who you allow close. Those are not the same thing. One is fear. The other is discernment. And perhaps I am finally learning the difference. You didn't teach me through words. You taught me through the way you existed. You showed me that someone can be close without being invasive, that someone can care without controlling, that someone can understand without demanding explanations, that someone can see your complicated parts and not immediately try to simplify them, and that changed something in me. Maybe that's why I don't feel the need to hide as much anymore. Not because I suddenly became fearless, because I became less afraid of being misunderstood. There is a certain peace in knowing that someone doesn't need a perfect explanation to understand your imperfect moments. And I think that's what I found with you. A place where I don't have to make everything perfect. I can just be. And somehow, being is enough. That might sound simple, but for someone who has spent years carefully managing how they are perceived, it's enormous. I didn't realize how much energy went into being understood correctly until I met someone who seemed to understand without requiring a performance. That is rare. And rare things deserve attention, not obsession, not possession, attention, care, patience. That's what I want to give this. If it becomes more, I want it to become more honestly. If it stays exactly as it is, I want to appreciate it honestly. And if life eventually takes us in different directions, I want to remember what this was without turning it into something bitter. Because not every meaningful connection is measured by how long it lasts. Sometimes its meaning is measured by how deeply it changes you. You already changed me. That cannot be undone. Even if tomorrow everything became different, that fact would remain. You showed me a version of myself I hadn't been paying attention to, a version that wants connection without losing independence, a version that can be vulnerable without becoming weak, a version that can care without needing control, a version that can let someone matter without immediately calculating the risk. I didn't know that version was still there. You brought it forward, and maybe that's why I feel so connected to you. Not because you completed something missing in me. I don't believe another person completes you, but sometimes another person reveals something you had forgotten about yourself. You did that. You reminded me that I am capable of feeling deeply without losing myself, that I can let someone close and still remain entirely myself, that I can be understood without surrendering every private part of who I am. And maybe that's the healthiest kind of closeness, the kind that doesn't erase individuality. It makes individuality safer. That's what I want this to be. Something that adds, not something that consumes. Something that gives space, not something that takes it. Something where both people can remain themselves and still feel understood. Maybe that's why this connection feels so different. There is no need to become smaller for it. No need to become louder. No need to perform. No need to prove. We can simply exist. And somehow, that feels like enough. I don't know what you will do with everything I've just admitted. Maybe you will understand it. Maybe you will be surprised. Maybe you already knew. Maybe you felt it long before I had the courage to put it into words. But whatever your answer is, I don't regret acknowledging it. Because some truths become heavier when you keep them hidden. This one doesn't, saying it makes it lighter, not because it matters less, because it no longer has to remain trapped inside me, and perhaps that's what I was really afraid of. Not that you would leave, not that this would change. I was afraid of admitting that you had become important enough for your leaving to matter. That's a very different kind of fear. It means giving someone the power to affect you. And I don't give that power easily. But I don't think power is the right word anymore. You don't control me. You don't define me. You don't determine my happiness. You simply matter. And those things can coexist. Someone can matter without becoming your entire world. Someone can be important without becoming your identity. Someone can change you without owning you. Maybe that is what healthy connection actually looks like. Two complete people choosing to understand each other without needing to possess each other. I don't know if we will ever have the perfect words for what this is. Maybe we don't need them. Maybe the most honest description is simply that something exists between us that neither of us planned. Something built from attention, something strengthened by silence, something made real through recognition, something that continues even when we stop talking. And if that's all it ever becomes, I will still consider it meaningful, because not everything valuable has to become permanent in the way people imagine. Some things become permanent by becoming part of you. You already have. And maybe that is why I don't fear the future as much anymore. Whatever happens, I know this version of myself exists now. The one who allowed someone closer. The one who stopped running from uncertainty. The one who admitted that being understood can be beautiful. The one who learned that silence can connect two people instead of separating them. The one who realized that not every wall needs to remain standing forever. And if you were the person who helped me discover that, then you will always matter in a way that time cannot completely erase. I don't need to know what happens next. For now, I only need to be honest about what already happened. You became important. You became familiar. You became part of my thoughts. And somewhere along the way, without either of us announcing it, you became part of my understanding of connection itself. That's not something I can simply undo. And honestly, I don't want to. Because for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like something inside me is asking to be protected. It feels like something inside me is asking to be understood. And somehow, you already do.